Metropolitan State University is celebrating 50 years of championing access to higher education in Minnesota. Our first 50 years, Metropolitan State Oral History Project, produced by Metro State University in partnership with the Other Media Group, is a 4-part podcast series featuring first-hand accounts of experiences and stories from Metro State alumni, current and retired staff and faculty, and community members over the past 50 years. This podcast was made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee, or Metropolitan State University. Today's conversation topic is the evolution of the university to admitting first-year students, with 1977 alumna and current academic advisor Marcia Anderson and retired faculty and administrator Leah Harvey, with Alumni Directions Director and 2007 graduate Kristine Hansen.
So my name is Kristine Hansen, and I'm the Alumni Relations Director here at Metropolitan State. And we're here today to talk to an alumna and a former member of the faculty. And I'm going to ask Leah and Marcia, first Leah and then Marcia, to introduce yourself and tell us your relationship to Metro State and how you got involved in Metro State. So Leah, I'll turn it over to you.
My name is Leah Harvey. I started in Metro State as a faculty member in 1975. I moved up to be a dean. At that time, it was called the Dean of Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment, fondly known as CIA. I then was academic vice president for a number of years. I was the chief operating officer between presidents at one point. And then I went back to the faculty. My training's in statistics. So I taught statistics. I also taught in First College, the individualized educational planning. And I was interim dean after that in professional studies in urban teacher education. I was interim dean at one point for the College of Liberal Arts.
Marcia?
I found my admission materials. It was December 1974. I started as a student. And then I graduated in 77 under the name change to Metropolitan State University. And while I was a student, I was very enamored of Metro and its philosophy, and everyone did individualized programs then. It fit exactly what I needed to complete my degree as an adult student. I hadn't even thought I was going to come back because I had stopped out or dropped out of college, but I was able to do exactly what I needed with what was the individualized program, or the only program that was offered at Metro at the time. I was a junior, but it took me a couple of years, 3 years to be exact, because I was working full-time. At the end of my program, I actually started working for the university on a contract basis, doing publications work, which was my background in journalism. And then from there, it was a steady chart, if you graph it, to more and more work at Metro and less work anywhere else over time, until I ended up getting my graduate degree in adult learning and development and decided, well, okay, I'm making the change. I worked as a consultant or a contractor in publications and communications. I then had a stint working with the academic affairs vice president as staff associate, and part of that time was with Leah. I started on the community faculty actually right before I graduated, and did evaluations of journalism and writing, and taught some workshops, and started fairly soon after that also doing degree plan reviews of the individualized program, which was part of the process at the time to have an external reviewer. I decided to make the change to higher education, and I started to do additional part-time assignments while I was still working out in the world with admissions. And I ended up getting a full-time position in admissions, and then that eventually evolved into specializing in advising and coordination of student-directed learning, which is what I am now, the director of the Student-Directed Learning Office, which has finally been created. During all of that time, I was teaching and as a community faculty member. And I started teaching Perspectives, the educational planning and philosophy course. When we started admitting first-year students, I was part of the first faculty group to start organizing that course, and I began teaching that when it was first-year experience, and then continued to teach it as it changed into Your Academic Journey with a faculty review team. I have more recently taught Metro 100, which is getting credit for what you know for student-directed learning.
Thank you, Marcia. I appreciate it. So, can you give us a little context for what was going on in the early 90s in Minnesota within higher ed that sort of set the stage for Metro to begin admitting students without much prior credit?
There was a push to have a 4-year university or college in the Metro area because there were no choices for students, more traditional students, other than the 2-year colleges or the University of Minnesota. And at that point, the Higher Education Board came up with a proposal called MSPAN 2000, which was to make another university in the metropolitan area. Pressure was on the state university system at the time to establish another institution. And Metro State said, no, we don't need another institution. We can do it. And we can do it by working with the 2-year colleges. And that's how it started, was those closer connections with the 2-year colleges. But that was the discussion in the early 90s. I do want to make it clear, though, that we always had students who had no credits. We had what was called an equivalency program, where students could demonstrate that they had the equivalent of 90, at that time it was 90 quarter credits to be admitted to the university. So my first job was looking at piles of papers from students that outlined what they knew and could do and evaluations of that. And I sat with one of those little tape recorders that we used to have back in the day and would create their transcript from that. But those were our equivalency students, and they were admitted on the basis of that. And also, we offered lower division courses. When students came in to business and were working on a management degree, we offered the accounting course.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is that it was really an effort that was sort of driven externally. Is that right? Or was it something that was being driven internally by the faculty and administration of Metro?
I would say this. The upper division emphasis of Metro State, upper division only, was driven externally. It was because the 2-year colleges had been created in the last 10 years, probably. There was that we don't need any more lower division. We've got the lower division. Also, Metro State was created to serve adult students who one presumed had either some previous college or previous learning through other mechanisms. MSPAN 2000 report was external, but the external push was not for Metro State to be that 4-year institution. So the push to have a 4-year institution came externally. The push for Metro State to do it came from Metro State, saying, that's stupid. We're here. We don't need to have another 4-year institution in the Twin Cities. We just need to grow.
And wasn't Metro already growing? Wasn't it a gradual growth anyway?
Well, certainly students. And yes, the first majors, as Marcia mentioned, the first program was individualized program. We didn't have majors. We didn't have departments. We had areas. But the individualized program soon became, if you're in management, this is what you got to do. That's as individualized as it's going to get. And so we started developing majors. The first major was nursing, which needed that structure in order to get accredited. But it started moving forward. And as I said, we had to offer lower division courses to serve students in those majors.
So, Marcia, I know that you were one of the early advisors to students who were coming in with what was a low number of credits, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that experience.
Leah sent me a timeline, and I was reminded that we actually admitted sophomores first. And so it was a transition to admitting through regular admission rather than the equivalency assessment. First-year students for admission at Metro and everywhere is 0 to 16 credits of transfer is considered new first entering freshmen. And then 16 and above is considered a transfer first-year freshman student. And most of the people that I was involved with tried to emphasize the terminology first-year student and second-year student rather than freshman and sophomore, because those were traditional. That was traditional nomenclature, and still at that time, Metro didn't want to be necessarily traditional, and we thought our first-year and second-year students would be non-traditional in some ways. And in my experience, my experience at the time was in admissions, doing admissions counseling with any of our incoming students, and then gradually that kind of developed into a little bit of a cohort of first-year students that I worked with, and then later in advising and teaching of first-year students and first-year experience or Metro 101. When we started the expansion, we still got our Metro students. I'm seeing Leah nod. So that meant we were getting what we would now call post-traditional students. They were students who were like our quote-unquote older students, not necessarily right out of high school. I looked back at some of my folders, and indeed most of my classes had a pretty good mix of students who were right out of high school or soon out of high school, and students who had maybe been out of high school for quite a while, or at least some range there. They were not the traditional high school to immediately college model necessarily. They were place-bound. They were staying at home, or they were already out of the home living independently. They were working. That's a characteristic that has been true of our Metro students across our entire history. Most of them were working at least part-time, and many were working full-time. And they were from all the diverse characteristics of our Twin Cities metropolitan area in terms of their racial and cultural and ethnic backgrounds and gender. It was our Metro students coming as first-year students. And they were also similar because they were independent in some way. So maybe they were parents, even though they were 18. Or they were parents and they were 30. Or they may have been caretakers in their families of either younger siblings or even of parents or elders. And so they had this element of some independence. And that I always thought that was one of the things that drew them to Metro. Not only that there were definitely practicalities, low cost and commuter school, not expecting you to do everything during the day. So there were those matches. There was also tended to be students who were willing to come to a college or university that didn't necessarily have a name up there, in the ranks, and that wasn't necessarily what they were looking for, or they weren't looking for the residential experience. And so they, were a match for the rest of Metro. Although then the thing that they didn't have was a college experience coming in. They didn't have that, and many of them then and now were first-generation college students. They didn't necessarily have anyone in their family to tell them about what college and university was going to be like and what the expectations were. So that was very true of the first year and second year students, but that was also true of many of our transfer students. But the transfer students at least had a year or two or three of having the college experience. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure at admission stage, advising stage, and in Metro 101 was welcoming the students, making sure they knew that they belonged, even though they were, as first-year students, a very small percentage of our student population, and trying to help them build on their strengths, self-assess, and learn skills and navigation so that they could succeed. So the idea of Metro 101 or first-year experience courses nationally is a college success course, kind of the tools to be successful in college. And for first-generation students particularly, that's a really important information set and skill set so that they can feel like they can succeed and belong, and that they know that that their own backgrounds are going to be able to be an asset to them and build on that. So those were some of the things. There's kind of I would say there's a misnomer that, at least for Metro first year students, they are young, so therefore you can treat them like any other 18 or 19-year-old going away to college on their own. I've always thought that they shared many characteristics with our older adult students, and some of them were 40 or 45 as first-year students.
So the university probably knew that this was coming, that the opportunity to admit 0 to 16 credit students into first-year students into Metro State was coming. So what types of things did the university do to prepare for these new students to serve them adequately?
Let me start by responding to that, because it was big. We didn't have general education requirements. We didn't have admissions requirements. We didn't have a lot of those things in place at the time. And so the faculty had to work really hard. And seeing that I was the vice president at the time, I was rather involved in that process. But it was a lot of work to come up with all those policies and procedures that we hadn't needed when we didn't have students in their first 2 years. And as a matter of fact, it was very controversial and very contentious. And back to what Marcia was saying, one of the things that we didn't do was change the scheduling drastically. And I think that is one of the things that made the biggest difference in terms of our continuing to attract students who had concerns and a life outside education. That, on a traditional college campus, it's all about education and fun, I guess. But for our students, raising a family and keeping a job was more important than their classroom. And we were able to help them continue to do that by not changing the scheduling. So, but I would say putting requirements into place was one of the biggest challenges that we had in preparing for that.
I was involved in several task forces. I was kind of really surprised when I went back and looked to see whether I had any kind of a list. And there, like Leah said, there was faculty work being done and student affairs work being done all over the place to prepare for this. One of the other areas, maybe you can talk more to this, Leah, was the whole general education area, because the general education requirements were not applicable in the individual. Well, I don't know whether they were applicable or hadn't been adopted.
Because we didn't have them. We also didn't have grading criteria for many years. We had narrative transcripts. The narrative transcripts quickly turned into pre-printed narrative transcripts. Instead of writing out the narration for every student in the class, faculty had pre-printed forms with fill in the blanks. And one of those blanks was often a grade equivalent of whatever. If this were a grade, it would have been a B. We did adopt a grading policy when we went to the 4 years. Before that, we had 5 competence areas that students were supposed to address in planning their programs. And that was our general education, basically. And students came in with all sorts of learning from all sorts of places, and they could sort that into those competence areas. But then when we started admitting students who came without any credits, we needed to be clearer about what those general education requirements were. And faculty are very conservative. They came to Metro State and they were really excited about doing something new and having that opportunity. And, you told them be creative, think broadly, and they'd be way out there. But then when you say, well, we need to back up a little bit, there's no backing up a little bit. They back to what they know and what their experience was. And you have to remember that faculty have had a lot of experience in a university. They have PhDs. They've been in that academic setting for a good part of their lives. So, it's much harder to get them to think in between. So it came in the end, the general education requirements were pretty much traditional requirements, as in most institutions. And then when MnSCU came around and they started adopting general education requirements across all institutions. And that in some ways made it easier for Metro State because we couldn't argue about it.
And there was a similar pattern to what Leah just described that went on among the faculty who were involved in trying to start the first year experience course. Because, again, we were Metro, we were supposed to be innovative. We could have, designed it all new, but we ended up pretty much starting with a model that was in existence at another university. Tweaked it some, but it became a pretty standard intro to college, intro to study skills, and it was only 2 credits, first year experience to start. There were many discussions about whether the course should include, disciplinary content, like a kind of an honors type course would, where you would have a sampling of literature and some history. There was discussion of that, but that was rejected pretty much because there wasn't much agreement on what that should be, and there was a lot of everybody wanted their part in, and we couldn't figure out how to put it all in a 2-credit course, so it ended up being the smaller package that there was already a model for. But as we started to teach it, there was a group of mostly community faculty and one or 2 resident faculty who taught it regularly. As we taught it, then we began to realize what the students really needed. And what they needed was some of what I referred to earlier. They needed to know more about what academic culture is like and what academic expectations are in a college and university. And so we added more on critical thinking, and we added more reflection on what academic culture means. And about, as we progressed, we even added things like what are disparities in higher education and how are you encountering them, and what are resolutions to them. It moved off its original base of just some study skills as we started to realize what students needed beyond just a toolkit. And that made it a much more engaging course, I think. I went back and pulled out one file that I found in my dusty office that showed that the critical thinking theme and thinking about their thinking was one of the things that the students reported they really enjoyed, and they enjoyed realizing that that was going to be something that they would use in all the rest of their classes. It was like, this is powerful, and this allows me to do more than I realized I was going to be able to do. And they also liked that it allowed them to critique. One of the outcomes in my classes that was always enjoyable was I would have to say, now remember, you know how to do critical thinking analysis, but you can't go imposing this on everybody in your life right away. There will be resistance to that. So then it expanded to a 3-credit course, and then we decided that it was a better name would be Your Academic Journey, because it had gotten a bigger frame to it.
Do you feel, because sort of in my role as the alumni director, right, I have the opportunity to kind of look back through sort of a lot of older material, and it's my observation that the 90s was a time of real expansion and change for Metro State. And do you feel that some of this was driven by the new students? What were some of the forces that drove all the change that happened in the 90s?
Well, I think to a large extent, it was going to 4 years and having to look at education differently. But it was also an evolution of the institution. Metro State was started to serve adult students who had a lot of experience and who hadn't been able to finish college. And if you look back at some of those first students, you will see that there were some very experienced and important people in that group, because there were quite a few people in that situation. And the emphasis was really on helping them. The story, which I don't know whether there's any truth to or not, is that Charlotte Metow, who was the wife of the chancellor, did not have a college degree. And the U of M would not accept her for a 4-year program because she was old and she didn't have what she needed. And so he said, we need an institution that will do that. And it was almost overnight that Metro was set up. And so, but that was the kind of student it was set up for. And originally, the thought was there wouldn't be any classes at all, that everything would be learned outside in the community. People would bring in all the knowledge they had. And it didn't take long before they started creating group learning opportunities, which pretty soon we realized should be called classes. So I think in some ways it was just a continuation of that evolution, and maybe the evolution was to some extent exponential. It started growing a little, changing a little more quickly as time went on. And the emphasis then was more broad.
And also the emphasis became possible and also kind of likely, given the growth and the evolution, that it became more traditional. There were more faculty hired from traditional programs, and they wanted to start their own majors. And so there were these varying forces. The students were coming who were open to taking majors, and some of them sought majors, and faculty wanted to do the majors. So many more majors. Leah, wasn't it the period of the 90s and 2000s that most of the majors were created?
Yes, but again, I think it's evolutionary. We had pretend majors, just as we had pretend grades and pretend classes, we had pretend majors. And we just didn't call them that. And Marcia's right. It has to do with a faculty they come from academia and they think like academics. But I would also add that one of the things that happened was the growth of the community colleges. As they became stronger, they wanted their students to have a place to go to finish their 4 years. And at that time, the U was not terribly hospitable. So that was also the time when we started developing articulation agreements with everybody, saying that if you did 2 years here, you do these classes in your 2 years and you come to Metro State and you can finish in 4 years. So I think that growth of the community colleges also fed the growth of the more traditional emphasis at Metro State.
That was reflected in what was happening in the admissions office, because all of the counselors had liaisons with a community college or two. It is expected that there will be a good number of transfers from community colleges. And we were also going, once we started admitting first and second year students, we were also going to high schools. The counselors from the private colleges and occasionally the community colleges that were there at the college fairs at high schools or working with the college counselors at high schools, we were an oddity to them. And I mean, when I would go to a high school, I would enjoy it, but I did not really see a really clear match with lots of the students, especially when the other colleges were coming in, handing out swag and T-shirts from their college, and we didn't even have any. And, we were just still not very traditional in those respects, and we didn't fit the mold. So again, like I said, for quite a while, we would get students from high schools who didn't think they fit the mold either. The articulations and the pathways that were developed with community colleges were a really strong enrollment driver. But then the community colleges also developed those with private colleges as well, and with the U of M. So there was a boom of that, but then that boom kind of leveled out.
Another thing I would say about Metro State, the focus of the university has always been on students. We always considered ourselves a student-centered institution. And the university's changed a lot over the years, but I don't think that has changed considerably. I think that is still, if you talk to faculty and staff, and student-centered is as opposed to faculty-centered. Many institutions that you go to are more faculty-centered. Now, having said that, I will say that there's a move in higher education to be more student-centered, in part fueled by money and enrollment, but also in part fueled by the idea that maybe that's what we should be doing. We were there when it was not popular, and one of the things I'm happy to see is that Metro State is still there.
Advising is something that's really central to Metropolitan State and to the Metropolitan State student experience. How did that change when the first year and second year students started to be included? What was the change? Was there a change to staffing? Was there, were there hurdles to overcome with regard to advising?
Well, there were changes, and there were changes, and there were more changes. When I look back, it's one of the things that has been most studied, most revised, and then revised again, and then revised again. I couldn't find in my records what we did originally when we first started admitting first-year students, but after a while, we started having specialized assignments of first-year students. We did that in admissions, and I was one of those people. The colleges also assigned one advisor. But then that went through some evolution, and there was some push to look at cohorts within the cohort, so to speak. Undecided students who were first-year students were one of those cohorts, and that group got an advisor assignment, Donna Blacker. There was a back and forth about whether first-year students should have a centralized advisor or whether they should have a college-based advisor like the rest of the students. And that kind of went back and forth a couple of times. We had the creation of Gateway, the one-stop shop generalist advising center later. But that idea of, these newer students to college are going to need a lot more of those kinds of support services, so maybe they should be assigned to one student affairs area. And that didn't go for very long. I think there was a period when we even had cultural coordinators and academic advisors dual advising first-year students. So it's gone through many permutations. I'm pretty sure now we have most of the freshmen and undecided students go to the College of Liberal Arts, and that is mainly because that college decided to create an advising staffing for those students, and because of the need for those students to have a lot of their advising about general education and graduation requirements. I don't know that we have reached the pinnacle, though, because it keeps coming up. It's come up again in the latest student mapping project about whether that cohort even is a cohort and whether they should be treated differently. One other way that we did decide early on to give that group of students an extra support was to provide dedicated freshman new student orientation. And then once Power of You started, which the Power of You took over and did its orientation for freshmen along with the Power of You broader set of onboarding programming. We also had at one time a summer bridge program. So there were a lot of the models chosen. I think now there is a component of the regular online orientation that is for freshmen.
I used to keep a folder with university plans in it. And every time a new plan came out, I'd go through my folder to find an old plan that had the same things in it.
So Power of You, how did Power of You get planned and how did it get implemented for first-year students?
It never really took off. I mean, it was supposed to be a collaborative program and getting more students involved and helping them out, but collaboration is not easy.
So Power of You was supposed to be an initiative funded so that students could have their first 2 years free. Certain group of students who had just graduated high school in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And Metro was going to be the transfer institution in that role in the second year or after an associate's degree. But we did see a bump in student enrollment from freshmen as a result of the promotion that happened around Power of You. So students decided to come to Metro as freshmen, including deciding to go to St. Paul and Minneapolis College. So it was an indicator to me that Metro may not have been, for most of that history, seen as the right place for a first-year student to start. But if it got promotion and students out there who were considering schools saw the framework that Metro offered, then it did draw students. The Power of You period of 2 or 3 years was among the highest enrollment in Metro 101, but that enrollment was still not very high.
No.
I actually looked. The highest was close to 200 students in that Power of You span for Metro 101 enrollment over the year.
I mean, you have to keep in mind, too, that the 2-year colleges are very student-centered. They're located all over the metropolitan area, and they're less expensive. And we made it as easy as we could for those students to transfer. We did not put barriers up.
And that was one of the documents that I found in looking back on the history was I found in admissions a kind of an outline that we did of what would be the situation a first-year student would be in that would make them a good match for Metro and what would not, because that was our reality. And we were counseling students for what would be the best match for them. In many cases, it was the community or technical college, not Metro. So we wanted to be honest with them about that. And we even had a chart showing the differences between Metro and Minneapolis College to make it visible.
So you mentioned, how the community colleges were all over the Twin Cities, making it more attractive for students. It also occurs to me that right around this time, Metro started to consolidate into some locations. Was that related to the change in the student body? Was that related to admissions?
I think it was just practical. Originally, Metro State, we were started with, $250,000? There wasn't money for rent. There wasn't money for faculty. But over the years, as we grew as an institution, that became less and less of an issue. And having to pack up and go to, from a faculty and staff perspective, if not a student perspective, go to a school somewhere to teach a class was just, not worth it. And students couldn't come and talk to an advisor and then go to class, or register and then go to class. You'll hear stories, and it's true, of students in classrooms with little kids' class desks that they have to sit at. And I remember teaching at Sabathani, and I was pregnant, so I was quite warm, but the students in the classroom were all wearing mittens. And it's hard to take notes and statistics when we just had so little control over things. On the other hand, we did lose that convenience. We were in Bloomington, for example. But during the oil crisis, the decision was made to move in. So by the time we actually started narrowing things down a lot, we were already out of some of the outer suburbs. We spent a long time looking for a St. Paul campus. The people who were doing it at the university would have preferred a more central location rather than the east side. But the then Senator Randy Kelly basically said, this is where you're going to be. And for the neighborhood, he was right. I mean, it's made a big difference in the neighborhood.
I was among the people who really liked that we had different locations. It was a selling point for students that lived nearby, as Leah said, but when we couldn't sustain that and sustain rotating classes to those locations.
It did. It got to be a logistic nightmare, as they say.
I can imagine. Well, so that kind of wraps up sort of the formal questions. Are there things that I'm missing about this experience? Are there things that, that as you reflect upon it, that you feel like should be in the history of Metro State?
The fact that the institution has remained committed to serving a diverse student population, diverse in ethnic diversity, but also age, and people who have other responsibilities in addition to school. And Metro State has remained committed to making sure that those students have the opportunity to get a good education. And there's nothing like watching students cross the stage. You see young students with their shorts on under their caps and gowns, and you say students where somebody in the audience is going, "Go, Grandma!" So, you don't see that too many places.
What Leah said about student-centeredness is really still true at Metro, and was true then and is true now. There may be more students who are interested in coming to Metro State now for, say, the health sciences programs, the science programs and health sciences programs, which need, by their nature, a sequencing of courses that starts early in your program or early in your degree program. So I think that's one of the things that's drawing some younger students now. But I looked back at the numbers, and the numbers are very comparable. We've always had somewhere between 200 and 300 first-year students, anywhere from 3 to 5 Metro 101 sections a semester, primarily in fall and spring. I mean, I was kind of surprised to see that when I looked at the actual history, because right now we're hearing that our admission is trending younger, and that younger students are among the higher rate of increase. When the number is really small, the trend can look like it's really steep when you add a few students. So we really haven't gotten more than the 300 or 400 students that we've ever had as first-year students. What may be changing, though, is our perception of our students, recognizing, I think, in a student-centered way, that our students are that category now that's trending, that phrase that's trending of post-traditional, which to me means that you can't pin down the characteristics. They are diverse characteristics of students, and they need to be approached not so much as categories of students and what this category of student might need, but more the way we've always approached them, which is in an individualized and personalized way. we listen to them, and advisors and admissions counselors and faculty are always listening for where their students are coming from and what their students say they need. And if we stay there with that, we'll be fine. I think that if we take anything from the history of our first-year students, it should be about that they are unique students, and we need to pay attention to how they are unique and not try to characterize them in any way that's a box.
Thank you. And I want to thank both of you ladies for joining us today. I think it's the greatest pleasure for me is to be able to talk to folks who have a strong connection and a deep connection to Metro State history.
Our first 50 years, Metropolitan State Oral History, is a limited scope oral history project made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee, or Metropolitan State University. We'd like to thank our participants and alumni for sharing their stories. These include Marcia Anderson, Leah Harvey, Jim Lukashevsky, Susan Rydell, Karen Sweet, Mel Henderson, Butch Kramer, Abu Ahmed, Anissa Hajimanen, Lucky Lee, Ki Yang, Joyce LeClaire, Daniela Bebe, Julia Eslinger, Jay Jaffe, Ocean Kalin, and partner Halil Lee of the Other Media Group. We would also like to thank Emily Seddon, Sai Chang, Kristine Hansen, and Majed Mohammed for their technical and administrative support.